So the idea behind this is kind of, it's still an experimental talk. I'm still working on it, you know, and it's got some loose ends. But the basic idea is to trouble the bright line separating creative work from academic research. And I'm doing this really, this is a composer's talk, but I'm combining certain things from non-arts areas of inquiry. Um, but the focus is it's around a number of my own work, cases from my own work as a composer and interactive artist. Can you see that? Is that better? Sorry about that. And this is going to be kind of a media-rich talk. I want you to experience these works in some way. We'll be watching screen and listening to stuff a lot. The works themselves are diverse in content, affect, and range from computer music performance and interactive installations, opera, even like a Hörspiel kind of thing. Each of these works was developed through a combination of ethnographic method, historical and archival work, analysis of musical practice, and critical examination. I was calling this a form of ethnographic art making, but I heard that ethnographic art was something else. So I could either try to take it back, you know, the way the popular music people took over the word new music in the 80s, the new music seminars and all that. I was hoping to get, I'm going to try to, you know, reframe that a little bit, but the results of this work are serving in turn as an impetus for my musicological writing, and the works themselves on histories of larger networks of musical practice that these works draw upon, and on still larger socio-technological networks and practices that all of us encounter every day. So I wanted to draw Joseph Kossuth's 1975 essay, "The Artist as Anthropologist." It was very interesting. You know, it's an interesting essay, and he had a chance to think about it, and even in the notes from the from later editions, republications of the article, he admits that his view of the anthropologist's work was sort of overly constrained, and in a way, particularly as I see it, with respect to autoethnography and the complications of othering that Hal Foster was grappling with in an even later essay, The Artist as Ethnographer. But I can still draw some lessons from Kossuth's observations. Here's what he says here. Artistic activity consists of cultural fluency. When one talks of the artist as an anthropologist, one is talking of acquiring the kinds of tools that the anthropologist has acquired, insofar as the anthropologist is concerned with trying to obtain fluency in his or her own culture. For the artist, obtaining cultural fluency is a dialectical process which, simply put, consists of attempting to affect the culture which he is simultaneously learning from and seeking the acceptance of that same culture which is affecting him. What may be interesting about the artist as anthropologist is that the artist's activity is not outside, but a mapping of internalizing cultural activity in his own society. So, and I'll get back to this a little bit later, these wonderful people here. But for now, I want to switch a little bit to the first of the pieces that this is not the first, but certainly something, a piece that exemplifies what I'm going to be talking about. In 1998, I was part of a team of artists, including the poet Quincy Troop, commissioned by the San Diego Arts and Culture Commission, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Metropolitan Wastewater District. Now that's a consortium that we don't face every day. And our remit was to embed art into the design of the Point Loma wastewater treatment plant in San Diego, California. The piece is called Information Station Number 1. It was opened in 2000. I think it's still working, so you could find out if you visit San Diego. But in 1998, the plant was still under construction, and our team of artists all worked with architects and engineers examining blueprints and discussing art and music with sewage plant officials. My starting point was to create an interactive information kiosk that would, as I wrote in my proposal, quote, redefine the nature and function of the information kiosk in order to create a kind of information display about the plant that allows the visitor to experience information rather than, quote, retrieving it. B, permits the visitor to, I'd say encourage these days, to create information rather than navigating among prefabricated choices. And C, encourage encourages direct physical contact as a primary medium through which the visitor's experience with the information is mediated. So this contribution, the kiosk, sought to bring information about the plant from artists, plant management and employees, government sources, and our own investigations to a single point. The result was a multi-channel interactive documentary about a period in the life of an industrial facility and the various actors who animated. One of the active channels, of course, was the visitor, who could draw from a rich and diverse palette developed through an ethnographic process. Interviews with technicians, operators, supervisors, and other plant employees, images of them at work, views and sounds of the landscape of the plant, including flora and fauna, land, air, and ocean, flow charts summarizing plant operation, the sounds and images of the plant's machinery, including underground areas, presentations of the history of sewage in the San Diego area since the late 1800s, officially published histories and information about the plant, including brochures and videos taken by remote-controlled sewer inspection drones. So they had, it's sort of amazing. The history of sewage is quite amazing. First of all, San Diego, you know, in before 1900, San Diego had open sewers, right? So the big deal was they actually got a sewage treatment facility where they could close all those open sewers so people get drunk on Saturday night, they wouldn't fall in. People threw stuff on the street, you know, it was quite late. I mean, I thought they finished that in Paris quite a long time ago. Well, San Diego took its time about doing it. In any event, every year for several years, on the same day, New Year's Day, they would publish an article extolling the virtues of the sewage plant and how it was something that would encourage, you know, massive investment in the San Diego area, would help the infrastructure and economic base of the city, providing, you know, it was extraordinary. It was like really serious boosterism, and sewage makes it all possible, which, and the fact that they dumped it all into the bay didn't really matter at the time. And this plan, among others, was supposed to fix that. So anyway, to reflect all this complexity, we settled on the use of 3 screens of video images with multi-channel sound. There was the video tracking technology of the late 1990s, could extract information from hands and bodies in space. And when you watch others in dialogue with the kiosk, you see that the person's in encounter with the piece becomes just as interesting as the sounds and images being shown. Moreover, you see how the intentions, values, and expectations that people have regarding computers matter just as much or more than the actual content of the work. I mean, this piece was in dialogue with the emerging new media discourses of the 90s. Or rather, really, those expectations about computers are part of the content of the work. The notion here is that the system, like any artwork, has its own story to tell, and when the visitor and the system interact, a larger story, a more complex community is created. The system became an expressive medium, in many ways like a musical instrument. Another thing that happened was we had to fix it because we went back and they said it's not working, can you come out? So in 2009, it ran for a pretty long time, then it finally broke. And so we went out in 2009, about 9 years, and Damon Holzbar and I went out to the plant to update the hardware and software and record new interviews, including some of the same plant personnel we had interviewed a decade earlier. We heard that plant employees were also visitors of the piece. They went there quite a bit, and they had long referred to it as the fireplace. I thought that was very beautiful, a place to sit and contemplate. We're glad the fireplace is getting fixed. That was great. The thing is about interactive work, especially sound work. I've always tried to make things that turn off the piece when nobody's playing, nobody's in it, because otherwise the thing plays all day and it annoys people, and those people have to work there in the art gallery or whatever, and the people who worked in there, they weren't gallerists, they were sewage officials, so you wouldn't, it was nice to make it sort of nice for them. So here's what it kind of sounds like.
San Diego's public art policy encourages the involvement of artists in the design and construction of public facilities.
If you make a sound related to any kind of organized fashion, or even disorganized fashion, it's kind of like a music. It depends on where you're at and when you're there, and depends on what you're hearing.
Just what you wanted to see just before dinner. the thing I found out from doing this work, public art is highly contested. Anyone who's read a book like The Destruction of Tilted Arc, the Richard Serra work in New York, that could give you a sense of what's going on there. It's really highly, and not always cryptically, politicized. The information function of kiosks has that nature. The choice of available information is mediated by the usual social, cultural, political, and economic factors, and even the choice of interface device is politically imbued. I sought to encourage explicit bodily movement, as I said, but I had to keep telling people over the nearly 2-year course of working on this that I wasn't trying to create an information kiosk. I was creating an artwork based on the idea of the information kiosk. And as the piece began to take shape, this attempted redefinition of interactivity was being threatened with becoming overwhelmed by the power of the then emerging, but by then already surprisingly vernacular notion of interactive multimedia. So interactive, even in the late 90s, by that time, everybody had a mouse or some other interactive doodad, on their desk at work, So other modes of interactivity, such as the ones we are proposing, like you see here, those modes became somehow strange or different or alien. This ubiquity of a particular narrative about interactivity, I think it also affected even critically informed and engaged artists, as basically we're all using these kinds of tools to create the work. But see, what we need to remember is that I had to remind people, really, this mode of interactivity, mice, trackpad, screens, WIMPs, GUIs, all that, which was then emerging. And all of it came from, Xerox PARC anyway. And in any event, it wasn't somehow objective or universal to the experience of interaction with computers, but the approach was rooted in particular networks of social practice and economic imperatives. So once it became clear to the wastewater people, the arts and culture people, that this piece was not going to be point, click, eat, it wasn't going to be about that. Even some people within these areas they were reluctant to describe the work as an information station. In other words, this paradigm of information retrieval had colonized and redefined the notion of information itself. And information had really become a metonym for the articulation of our hierarchical relationship, a means of articulating an approved grand narrative, the official story, and any other relationship could not, by definition, produce information. And so the attractiveness of this grammar of encounter to corporate thinking amounts to a quiet reversal of the notion that the user is being empowered by interactivity. The mouse becomes an instrument of control, but that control is not necessarily located in the body and mind of the person pushing it around the desk. Therefore, it seems that the provider of the information, rather than receiver, is being empowered. And in the 90s, that wasn't really very clear, but it should be very clear now with the advent of big data mining by companies like Facebook and Google, which really didn't exist when this piece was being made. In 1998, Sergey Brin and Larry Page published the basic Google paper. So there was no Google. So these kinds of pieces, we had to encounter these kinds of ideas as we went along. So this Whispering Bayou, which is much later, it was 2015. I took a similar ethnographic approach with that project, which was shown actually between July and October of this year at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. It's an immersive multimedia installation, a video triptych, once again, multi-channel soundscape composed of the sounds, voices, and images of Houstonians and their city. The project was a collaboration with Houston-based filmmaker, interactive artist, and community activist Carol Parrott-Bleu and French composer and media artist Jean-Baptiste Barrière, both longtime associates of mine. And this installation is really strongly influenced by Jean-Baptiste's piece, Jardin des Songes, which allows visitors to upload their dreams to an interactive system and interact with their dreams and others with the system as an interlocutor. Now, in both of these pieces, viewers are presented with the fragments of the collected images and sounds. Each visitor creates her or his own individual experience, depending upon how they move through the space. So interactive interviews were a crucial component of Whispering Bayou. Let me show you a bit of that. I'll show you a bit of what it looks like before I tell you this next bit. Whispering Bayou was a collaborative project created by Carol Parrott Blue, Jean-Baptiste Barrière, and me, George Lewis. Each of the lead artists brings unique perspectives on interactivity, multimedia, sound, and image.
My name is Jean-Baptiste Barrière. I'm a French composer and multimedia artist. And in this interactive installation, Whispering Bayou, my contribution is to have conceived the interaction part and all the visuals. The interaction is based on the idea that people entering into space are actually going to dive into images and sounds from Houston.
I'm Carol Parrott Blue, one of the free artists involved in the making of Whispering Bayou. Whispering Bayou is a gift to Houston. It's about Brays Bayou, one of the 10 bayous in the city.
The artists who created Whispering Bayou interviewed nearly 100 people from diverse backgrounds about their experiences, memories, and visions of the past, present, and future of Houston.
So when you move into this installation, you actually, by your own movements, by your position in space, by the way you interact with the screens and the sounds, you actually control what is happening.
By experiencing Whispering Bayou, my hope is that Houstonians will appreciate the challenge that it has to make Houston into an international city for everyone.
So interviews were a crucial component of the piece. We engaged a local advisory team with diverse backgrounds and strong Houston roots to gather video field recordings of the region, video and audio interviews with residents past and present, and we used an interview protocol similar to the one I made for the, which I'll show you later about the book, the AACM book. We extracted audio and video excerpts from the interviews, taxonomizing keywords and phrases for recombination by the interactive system. And I'm going to play you examples from some of what we came up with. The categories, there are nine basic categories. One, they're names. We collected a lot of names, Houston names and non-Houston names. We asked people, were you born in Houston? When did you arrive and from where? And this is one of the more interesting answers we got.
When did you come to Houston?
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
You know, I think he came from Uganda. Another one of our tabs was political opinion, or economic opinion.
They're asking money like crazy, $2,000 a month.
Or another one was ethnicity talk.
It's more of them now than it is African American.
I don't feel any, stress. Okay, only one Asian in many other, Caucasian or African.
Basically, he said he didn't feel he was comfortable with the diversity of Houston. He wasn't looking for everyone to be Asian in his community. He was looking for a certain kind of diversity, and he's Japanese.
Most of my friends are American because I figured that would, help me improve my English.
So one of the tabs was language, in fact, and two others were memory and religion.
I've learned a lot of the family story, how one branch of the family followed Christianity, how the other followed Islam.
And one of the tabs, of course, was music. What are your favorite kinds of Houston music, and can you sing one or two of them?
You gotta be kidding me. I have to sing.
But people did. Or this one. What we were trying to do basically is we would take these little bits and we would the system, the video system never used these things as they actually were. They would come through your images somehow. It would take these images and recombine them. And the audio system did the same thing, 4 channels of sound in the space, various kinds of timbral transformations, some of them quite radical. But still, that provided the actual music for the piece, or the talking and the music itself. And finally, Carol Parrott-Blue talked about those 10 major bayous. Bayous, if you don't really know, are bodies of water, basically. And they're like rivers, but not really. Some of them, they flow, but some of them are also kind of static or nearly so. And they provide, anyway, fecund environments for wildlife, for biological life, and for the development of the city. Now, we drew upon the example of the bayou in envisioning visitor experience, and so we asked interviewees to say the phrase "whispering bayou" in English and in their native languages.
El susurro del arroyo.
I mean, people made these things up. I mean, there's a lot of times there's no real translation. Arroyo doesn't really mean bayou, but I mean, there's no translation for it. Bayou is bayou. That's it.
దాంట్లో వేచి ఉండి చూస్తే చేపలు తాబేళ్లు చూడడం కూడా చాలా ఇష్టం నాకు.
Ipsífiri do Valto.
Chaputeio de Potok.
Dòng sông thì thầm.
Time for a new piece. Oh, before I leave this one, I wanted to tell you that we talked about in Jardin des Champs. Also in this piece, Houstonians were encouraged to visit whisperingbayou.net, and they could upload their own video stories, which we periodically added to the collection of images and sounds that you see here. In addition, my associate Damon Holzborn created the web-based program Personal Bayou, which allows anybody with a smartphone and some internet access or a tablet or to access images and sounds reminiscent of the piece. And you can actually use Personal Bayou here or anywhere else. It doesn't really matter. I tried it in the Czech Republic on my iPhone 4. It worked fine. But for some reason, it doesn't work on my iPhone 6. I mean, you can get the images, and if you shake the thing, you can hear them. But the idea was we would have people uploading personalbayou.com in the space, and they could play with it like it was an instrument, in addition to the sounds that were already being made in the space. Or that they could take it home and just look at the images. And so, personalbayou.com, you could try it. I mean, you could try it right now if you like. It doesn't matter to me. But I mean, then that whole thing, the sounds would be kind of a counterpoint to what I'm going to say next. So that's the end of part 1 of this talk. So in part 2, I want to trace the evolution of my particular understanding of the notion of the slave's narrative, which is the slave narratives were sort of the theorizing of them as a literary form, the American chattel slavery experience, and there's slaves who created these narratives about that experience. Starting with the work of Henry Louis Gates and his mentor, Charles Davis, the father of Anthony Davis, the opera composer. So I want to talk about this in a couple of different works. All of these works crucially involve the concept that we're talking about Black lives matter. In this case, it's Black liveness that also matters. I'm tracing the sounding subject through a notion of community voice and a nascent concept of Afro-humanism. So the first piece is from 1991, Changing with the Times. And that was the most extended of the dramatically oriented works I made in the 80s and 90s. The text is based on an essay created for an adult education class by my father, who was then 68 years old and newly retired from 38 years with the U.S. Post Office in Chicago. I also video recorded stories, informal conversations with him. The often whimsical reminiscences and tall tales, about him and his grandfather, were painting these very vivid portraits of rural Southern life among African Americans during the Depression, the Great Migration to the urban North, and the troubled racial history of the U.S. These were pointed tales that invoke and establish mood, culture, and place, as well as 20th century African American and Chicago history. Now, these guys aren't part of the piece. Although in the end, that's my dad actually, and that's his grandson. Quite a while ago, maybe 2007. And I want to present, before we hear some aspects of the piece, I want to present sections from an article in Bomb magazine in which the guitarist Jeff Parker interviewed me about the piece. Well, I'm saying here, the other sort of important point for me was doing the Changing with the Times recording, which really deals with history, with memory, and sort of interrogates how black males are viewed in society through looking at an older black male, in this case, my father. And using his text, an original text by him, which he didn't write for that purpose, it was more or less a found text. I found this autobiography which he had written, and it turned out he was writing it as a slave narrative. You know, he went to this adult education class, and they said, well, okay, you all read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and then write your own autobiography. So connecting all those older black Americans historically with that form and legacy is what they were trying to do. And so at that point, I started to realize I wanted to keep doing work like this. And you start to see that even in the pieces of mine that don't have an explicitly political text, it's all shot through in any event with the usual dimensions of class and race and gender, sexuality, and the rest of it. You know, it doesn't mean that I want to start creating, you know, that whole thing they say, I guess in classical music mainly about political music, you know, my music is not political, people are trained to say that, you know, or rather, I don't make political music. There's a lot of talk about the idea that political music really, you know, Frederick Chesky notwithstanding, I mean, political music just isn't quite as good as music, which is apolitical somehow. But, you know, and then I said, I don't think we need to borrow from those discourses. I don't think we need to do that. I don't see any reason why music should be necessarily secular with no spiritual component, necessarily apolitical with no claims on society. So this is a bit of what it sounded like.
My grandfather always carried a gun. Now, he was a nice person, but he was from the school that wasn't going to take a lot. He'd treat you fair, but don't you go too far. He was a small man, but he was solid. Now, you didn't want to challenge him. Even the sheriff thought to leave him alone. I ain't scared of no sapsucker, he'd be saying. Now, when you got a smile out of him, you was doing something. And if you called him out of his name, called him a lie, that'd be enough to start a fight or something. Now, he had an argument with somebody one time, and the fella pulled a gun on him. Now, this is what I heard around the house. Now, the fella pulled out a gun and said to him, he said, okay, all right, you got a gun. Now, I'm going to turn my back, and I'm going to walk to my house and get my pistol. Now, if you got any heart, you shoot me right in here and now. Because if it was me, I'd shoot you right in your teeth. I guess that fella didn't do nothing. 1942 found me working in defense for the unheard of sum of $1 per hour. My grandfather was always scheming on how to get money. At the height of the Depression, he bought his girlfriend a full-length fur coat. Even the big white folks would borrow money from him then. And you'd never see him without a suit and tie on, not just on Sunday, every day. He said, look here, boy, I got a different suit of clothes for every day of the week. I didn't know where that money come from. And one day I went to school hungry, and when I got out of school, somebody said, let's stop by your granddaddy's wine shop. I didn't know nothing about it. I found out later about my granddaddy's grave robbing. They was burying people with money on them down there, and at the main chapel, they was searching for help. They might bury a man with a gold ring on his finger. You go down there later, after the funeral, dig him on up, get that ring, and return him to his eternal rest. He don't need that ring. This was the Depression. They still do it now. You buy one of them expensive caskets, they drop your butt in the ground and get that casket and sell it to somebody else. You might have paid $5,000 for that casket. He ain't got no use for it. You come along, take that casket, write him a check, and tell him, use that when you get where you're going. Now, that was just a joke.
You know, the thing is about this kind of work is that, you know, I don't have to my work as a composer of these kinds of texts mainly consists of editing things that people say. You know, I didn't make that up. I mean, it was just something he said, sitting there in the car and telling that story about, you know, write this check and throw it in the coffin. You know, so that was his slave narrative. Now here's a bit of mine. This is a travelogue from 2008, and that's where we're going to get into these people here. Travelogue is an audio installation that takes as its base materials my personal versions of the sonic chronicles that many people have been making every day. First with the early portable wire and tape recorders, and now with camcorders, digital cameras, movie capabilities, camera phones, and the like. The piece is influenced by my work on Lev Manovich's Soft Cinema DVD, for which I reviewed over 400 video clips he made of his travels in various parts of the world. He developed a taxonomy of these based on geographic location and viewer perspective. I took that taxonomy and developed a sound mix based upon it, and then it turns out that somehow he had hooked it up so that the DVD would actually, when you put it in your machine, that it would somehow take over your system and really automatically reconfigure itself to do different things and play different video clips every time. I don't know how that happened, but he said that he was doing it. In any event, working with Lev, who you might know him from the book, The Language of New Media, one of those classic books on the subject. It made me realize that as an artist who, actually I've traveled a fair amount myself over the past 40 years. And I've produced a lot of these recordings, you know, with early camcorders. And by the late 1980s, the development of visual recording technologies had increased the possibilities for this sort of thing. But living in a culture that privileges the visual, it took me a while to realize that just as with the video and the computer games, really, it's the sounds on these recordings that made the visuals seem real. They contributed just as much as the visual element to the understanding of space and place, and they also historically grounded my own claim to having been there and having existed in those spaces. And basically I found, as I went through these clips, I found that I pointed my camera at stuff that I thought sounded good. You know, I wasn't too concerned about how it looked. That was cool too, but if it didn't sound good, I didn't do it. So baseball games, political demonstrations, chatting with taxi drivers about quasi-illegal stuff they were doing. I mean, you know, 20 years of that produced Travelogue. It's about 4 hours of continually varying sonic scenes each day, and it's producing a kind of sonic ecology that's intended to regulate the flow of time and to subliminally stimulate and not really disturb all those who encounter it, to become utterly familiar and yet completely unrecognizable from moment to moment, and to express time as it's lived while not privileging any one moment. When you present that kind of panoply of materials over such an extended time span, it makes the experience simply too wide-ranging for any one person to gain a full understanding. Now, we had to, this was shown in a gallery in Belgium, in 2 galleries in Belgium, in Strombeek is one, then it went to Mechelen for another. And the show was called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And this is from the exhibition catalog. So these catalogs, you know, it's hard to make sound for them. So this is supposed to be evocative. The first one, I'm not sure when I recorded that. I've been looking for the clip of it, but this is Italian home shopping. And, you know, and she's delivering this rapid fire monologue about this exercise machine she's selling, and there's all this jiggling going on. Okay, so the one on the right, you know, like LL Cool J is jiggling, baby, you know, kind of thing. Then there was like, Ivan Bajik, one of the early chairs of the ACM. This one, the bike person is from Beijing in '96. The one on the right here, that's my uncle who was watching, you know, WWF, you know, wrestling. He really liked wrestling, you know, he really got into it, man. And so, and this one is a political demonstration from the Koenji region of Tokyo. And this is something just waiting for a train in the outskirts of Tokyo. So here's a bit of what it sounds like. I'm not going to, you know, it's a long piece, so. So, well, it's a curious thing. Sometimes it comes down to opportunity. The marching actually comes from, I was in Warsaw at some point, and walking down the street, this marching band came, and they marched to a cathedral. And then I went into the cathedral, and there were these people singing they were singing outside the cathedral on the street. So I just stuck with them. You didn't hear that. But then the other thing, the Japanese sound truck was actually, I happened to be in Tokyo during the emperor's funeral, and these sound trucks were all over the city playing these things. So, so things like that. The Polish experience, I also shot video in Lublin, which is where I learned how people say nigger in Polish. And so the things you learn on these adventures is all very interesting. I guess you have to block that out now. Is that PC over here, not to say that kind of thing? I mean, look, I could tell you the Polish word, but you know, that wouldn't be PC. But so it turns out, and the last person there was in the Innviertel region of Austria, and they had this sort of brass band, and they were showing me how to play their kind of brass band music. There's a certain lilt to it. You know, the next town over has a different lilt than this town. So his thing was like bum 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 bum. No, bum 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 bum. That's it. Yeah, that's it. I spoke too soon. I mean, I haven't practiced in a while. But the idea there was, you know, in a way, when I listen to these things, I'm not sure what they evoke in different people. So I'm mainly, in a way, composing for myself and evoking what works for me. So this is the last bit. We had the UK premiere in Huddersfield of my most extended project, the opera Afterword, where I discovered that by reading the newspaper that not everyone likes ethnographic opera as much as I do. And also that, and I found that the article itself is, you know, it could be, if Nicholas Slonimsky were still alive, he would probably think of this as being a great thing for the next edition of the Lexicon of Musical Invective. But in any event, I developed a libretto for this piece from transcriptions of interviews for this book, A Power Stronger Than Itself. And the original model was the book's concluding Afterword chapter, which I introduced with the discussion of James Clifford's influential essay on ethnographic authority. I used this essay as a touchstone for establishing my working method for the chapter. As Clifford writes, one increasingly common way to manifest the collaborative production of ethnographic knowledge is to quote regularly and at length for informants. But such quotations are always staged by the quoter and tend to serve merely as examples or confirming testimonies. Looking beyond quotation, one might imagine a more radical polyphony, but this too would only displace ethnographic authority, still confirming the final virtuoso orchestration by a single author of all of the discourses in his or her text. So in the book, I went ahead and admitted my presence as an orchestrator, but in composing the final chapter, I saw that my power in that respect was far from absolute. The voices in the chapter bring their own resonances, manifesting what I call an unstable polyphony of quoted voices that exceeded any authorial attempt to fully control them. Pursuing an aestheticizing experiment, an otherwise doggedly scholarly book of 800 pages or so, I created a polylogue from these quotations to imagine what an AACM meeting might be like with everyone present, living and ancestral, sampled from the many critical self-critical musings that I heard in my interviews. So I didn't have to prompt anybody. These themes seemed to recur, and I brought different articulations of these themes together in sections of the chapter. The individuals, individualism, expansion, identity, sacrifice, struggle, tradition, regrets, survival, the future, and of course the book project itself, which many people in the ASM were heavily invested in and commented on. They had tried to make, they had tried to make books about the ASM before, but if you want to make a book, you have to have a community to do it, if you want to get it out to to a lot of people, some of that community you have to have money, and so that's where the academic investing comes in handy. So I found that I was able to get the book done with the help of the university that I was working at. So anyway, this imagined intergenerational discussion treats these issues, overarching issues that both the organization, the ACM, and society more generally continue to face, asking how new relationships among expression, culture, race, and politics and personal aspiration can be forged, given the class and race-mediated refrains and anxieties of American cultural life. The lead artists, myself, film theater artist Catherine Sullivan and composer-director Sean Griffin, saw this interpenetration of scholarly and artistic method as a vital touchstone for an operatic experience. And I want to show one example of how we translated what we found on some of the audio archives into material for the opera. First, I want to say that Afterword, the name of the opera, is not a history of the ACM. I wrote a book to do that. But it's, well, I used this word. I went to Germany. I used this word. I thought, well, you know the term Bildungsroman, right? A coming-of-age novel. I said, well, this is German, right? You can do anything in genitive case. So I'm going to call mine a Bildungsoper. And I ran it by a few people. They said, cool. Any Germans here to check that out? Anybody want to say Bildungsoper? You know, I think it works. Anyway, it's a Bildungsoper, a coming-of-age opera about of ideas, positionality, and testament. There are no characters. Nobody plays Muhammad Abrams. In that sense, it has a considerable affinity with Brian Ferneyhough's Shadow Time with the libretto by Charles Bernstein. And again, I drew this libretto from the interviews I conducted for the book, as well as audio recordings of AACM meetings conducted in 1965 and 1966. They had recorded all their early meetings, and what we hear are young black experimentalists interrogating issues of power, authority, identity, culture, aesthetics, self-fashioning, representation. Now, in the opera, sung in spoken voices, instrumental music and movement more or less become heteroglossic avatars, but really more in a process that described of something that's been called in Toni Morrison's work, the expression of a community voice. In some of the opera sections, the community voice presents remembrances and testimony. In others, clashes between subject positions allow audiences to eavesdrop on history as is being made in real human time. I remember reading the other day in a New Yorker, said, what if you could like eavesdrop on what the surrealists were doing, or you know, they didn't record any of those things, right? So what if you just listen to it today? Well, in a way, this is what is happening here. And there's a lot of resonance. An interesting predecessor to this is Vijay Iyer and Mike Ladd's and Maurice DeCall's intermedia piece, which is called Holding It Down, which drew both dialogue and real-time images adapted from interviews the artist made with veterans of the Iraq War. This is Eugene Easton, saxophonist, and he was a signatory to the AACM Charter in 1965, and if you notice, this is the only, I think somebody said they really wanted to see at least one trombone picture. Well, there it is right there. And if I look a little tired, it's because I had a day job. I was writing advertising copy for an insurance company. You know, so people used to get these things in the mail, buy this insurance or else, that kind of thing. So one version of this approach, I'm going to show you how this works. This comes from the recordings Muhammad Abrams made of the first organizational meeting. There is no AACM, but they're trying to get one started on May 8th, 1965. And here, Gene Easton provides a sense of his own dreams and aspirations.
I think we're getting closer to this, to an explanation of this term, original music. Among some of us, it means something a little deeper than others. Original, in one sense, means something you write in the particular system that we are locked up with now in this society. We express ourselves in this system because it's what we learn. And as we learn more of other systems of music around the world, I mean, it's quite natural today, and we are getting closer to the music that our ancestors played and which we are denied the right to really stretch out in. And this term original, I feel that the authors of this business structure here had in mind more so sound-conscious musicians if necessary, finding a complete new system that expresses us. If you don't express in that is known, you're ostracized.
See, there's several interesting things about this. I found it fascinating because I wasn't there for any of this, you know. And I'm listening to these people who basically built the ACM. They're building it right while we're listening to it. And, you know, it's completely different from the stereotype of the jive talking jazzers, right? They're just talking to each other in a very, you know, in a very ardent and, you know, very pointed way about the experiences they're facing, their aspirations, their aesthetics, their philosophies of music, their philosophies of society. You know, this is what they're doing. And so, you know, I think it was new to a lot of people to not have that stereotype put out there once more. I mean, I think some of the people who received the opera were more comfortable with the tragic death model of African American musical life. That is the drug overdoses. You know, there's that book Jazz and Death by this wonderful doctor, and so, or the ones where, you know, various people get lynched or whatever happens. Well, that didn't really happen to these people. They actually did 50 years of work. The ACM is still operational. It's sort of known around the world. You know, it's experienced various, you know, it's been quite influential in a number of spheres of new music, and it was kind of a success of working class African American people. So, and that was something that I wanted to put out there in the opera, because basically what you have is a group of African American artists who were originally jazz musicians, but decided to revise the view of themselves. They had to start with themselves. They had to sort of, you know, fashion new discourses about themselves, and then to represent themselves in this way, and to struggle against people who were really strongly invested in the earlier representations. And if you're an artist, it's basically about representation. It's very important, you know. Among other, there's two aspects: there's representation, and you also have to find people who like you, and to not worry too much about the rest. So the idea, they don't know they're doing it, but what it comes down to is expanding the frame of possibilities toward a kind of post-genre practice. So I think to go back to Kossuth, I mean, he says, the hope for this understanding of the human condition is not in the search for religio-scientific truth, but rather to utilize the state of our constituted interaction. And so this project, and I'm going to let this project really have the last word, like everything I presented today, takes as its goal the blending of aesthetic exploration with critical examination of the multiple, overlapping, and fundamentally human contestations that affect us all.
It's time for musicians to let go of the others and start finding themselves, stretch out as far as they can. Most people here do want to play their own music. They don't get a chance. Someone else is in control. All of us would gladly play original music. But is that all we would allow? That would not make us free. We will be slaves to original music. Its association cannot enslave us, but it can free us to contribute something new. Do people even know what original music is? I don't. Originality, originate, origin, direct source, original compositions, originating from our souls. I think I see it now. A system we're locked up with now in this society. It's what we learned. As we learn more about the systems around the world, we found there is expression on a much higher level than we had been led to believe. Original means sound conscious musicians getting closer to the music our ancestors played, finding a complete new system that expresses us. We will be locked up in this system for the rest of our days, unless we find ourselves as a people. We're going to the vote right now! Of promoting ourselves, by saying,
I don't know, I like that. Anyway, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
To start with, what does AHRC exactly?
Oh, Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians.
So it's nothing to do with Afro-American.
Well, I think, I think that they could have called themselves an association. They had a thing called the Negro Musicians Association. They could have called themselves, I imagine, so many people, even now you hear people saying creative music, which is this term they apparently coined, which is now used a lot. They could have named themselves the Association for the Advancement of Jazz Musicians or the Association for the Advancement of Negro Musicians. And why they didn't do these things is what I was interested in. Because why did they choose to make a statement about themselves that didn't explicitly refer to race? which is something that one should have the right to do, but which is somehow, I wrote in the book that African American music is among the most heavily policed musics in the world, and the musicians are constantly being asked to limit their aspirations, and if they don't do that, often you run into problems. So I think that part of their prescience, pre-science, as some Rob might put it, was to see that in order to advance themselves, they needed to create new discourses about themselves and reinvent themselves, first to themselves, and then to the rest of the world. So that's why, maybe that's the explanation of the name.
Within the libretto, following on from that, but within the libretto, there's a series of interviews where it said we're not jazz musicians.
Oh yeah,
so there was a lot of discussions about what jazz meant for them back in '65.
Well, actually, there wasn't so much discussion of that. I mean, I listened to hours and hours of those tapes, and nobody really talked about jazz. I mean, except that one time when one of the people who actually later left the organization said, "Well, you know, we've got to really understand." This discussion was about whether the organization should stick with this original music policy, or whether we should try to incorporate other things from the black musical tradition, which had been sort of like, once again, what you were asking about the idea of why aren't you representing more of the race or whatever. And so what one guy said, well, you know, it's impossible for a young jazz musician today to, and then he just gets interrupted and says, we're not really jazz musicians. So that's a huge statement, because that takes them through a certain looking glass, you know, and they come out on the other side and they're somehow changed because they're not being limited to the discourses that are being placed upon them by societies, by record companies, by anyone really, academic institutions, other sources of power and authority. You know, just say that, because actually if you think about it, there are a lot of former jazz musicians in classical music, you know. Harold Budd, Don Martino, let's see, they're legion, and then you know, Mel Powell, and then later he's on the film with Louis Armstrong playing piano. So all those people are former jazz musicians, right? And then you later have the former rock musicians, but somehow Anthony Braxton couldn't be a former jazz musician. So that's an example of the policing I'm talking about, you know. So the thing is that really you should be able to create your own network of associations and references and kind of work out of that. And in my case, I find that I'm pretty curious, and the networks keep getting bigger and bigger, and then somebody tries to collapse all that on a single signifier. I say, you out of your mind? What are you talking about, you know? And a lot of that also came down to this notion of the public, the private and public transcripts that someone like James Scott theorizes. And I noticed that people would say, well, this or that famous musician, famous composer, you know, wasn't as dismissive of improvisation as you thought, as you said in your book, because, you know, we were talking in a bar or whatever, and I say, well, okay, it was great, that's a lot of bar talk, so when is one of your historians going to actually publish that? You know, where it becomes known. And, you know, and I found that there are very few examples. Here's one that came to me in a very interesting way. I used to perform on the Merce Cunningham events as an electronic music performer, sort of like what I'm going to do with Splitter. And I enjoy those kinds of things. I get to do whatever I want. Nobody dogs me about whether I have to play the trombone. They didn't care. You know, they did not care. And also, you don't even get to look at the dancers. If you look at them, it's like if you turn the pillar of salt, like Lot's wife, you know. Do not look. They put you in there. You're not supposed to do anything. You're supposed to play your music, and they play and they do their dance. That's it. So anyway, after one event, I guess the last one I got to do with them, I was just sitting there with Merce, and he said, well, you know, George, I didn't feel the same way about improvisation that John did. I said, wow, now where is this coming from? What does that mean? Anyway, that's a longer discussion. But then he told me about this concert that he did. He didn't say the year. He did a concert with Baby Dodds. I mean, some of you may know the person who did Louis Armstrong Hot 5 Hot 7s, the innovator of the modern drum set, one of the most important, arguably, jazz musicians of his time or any time. And so to imagine the two of them doing a concert was just amazing, you know. And what was more amazing is I hadn't found any text I eventually found one, I hadn't found any text in which this was talked about by anybody. So it was totally private transcript, me and Merce having a conversation. It turned out that David Vaughan, the Merce biographer, had written about this, but I found that out much later. I thought, well, this is a very interesting clash of cultures. It's something that really historians of musical experimentalism should have been interested in, but for some reason we're not. And that's a huge territory. People have written about Merce and Cage. And I wrote a piece about it. It's called Merce and Baby. It sort of depicts that whole situation, which has been played a few times. But in any event, I said, well, Merce, what happened, man? And he said, well, we couldn't get Baby to stop accompanying us. You know, that thing, they didn't want you accompanying the dancers, right? Well, I found out the year that they did this was 1946. So they've been working on this whole sort of differences, you know, non-intervention or non-interpenetration on dance and music. They've been working on that for a long time. And the other things that were performed on that concert, according to some archives I found, was Cage's two-panel transcription of Satie Socrate, which later turns into Cheap Imitation. And, you know, it was sort of amazing. So all this goes into my piece. But beyond that, just, this is a long-winded answer, but I'm just showing you, I'm very interested in those moments of cultural contestation, and it turns out that Baby Dodds wrote about this concert in his memoir. And here's what he said. He said, well, you know, this guy, Merce Cunningham, came over, this dancer, and he said, well, I want to play with you. And I said, well, I don't know what you want me to do. And he said, play something. I played something. He said, that's what I want. Then he started to talk about what happened in the concert, and he says, well, you know, at first, you know, I've never seen anything before or since like what this guy was doing, but I managed to really get on top of it. I was accompanying him. I hit the cymbal just the right time, and I was really getting into the dance and everything. That's exactly what he didn't want, right? So, like, but the thing is, that's a moment of a cultural clash which is very evocative, very, very, you know, it's a vibrant moment, which I would have thought historians of experimentalism would have been interested in, but hey, they had to wait for another generation. Let's say Benjamin Pickett or Gashi Uzunian or something like that. Yes?
Yeah, I was thinking connections like that. What did you think of Harry Smith's films to Monk's music?
You know, I don't know Harry Smith's film. I don't know that film. Can you tell me about it?
He apparently, he was at the 5 Spot. He would write down notation.
Mm-hmm.
I think written notation based on listening to Monk live, and then make handmade films. I think they were based on Monk. I think they were on Mysterioso. I'm sure. I think it's on YouTube.
I'm going to get a hold of that because I've never looked at that. I can imagine that someone like Steve knows this film, or someone like me. I don't know. You don't know either. That makes me feel a little better because I think he was knowing everything about this kind of thing. So if you don't know it, you're really stumping us here, man.
I think it's on YouTube. I think you can see them, and apparently that's how he did it. He sort of transcribed live.
They're online on the Harry Smith archive page. I forget the web page address for it, but it's online. They're really nice.
Now, what was your impression of it when you heard it?
I couldn't necessarily see the connection between the music as such from what I can remember. But I thought it was a really interesting connection of two cultures coming together. And particularly Harry Smith was involved with so much in that sense. There's so much music across the board. I mean, and crossing race barriers. I think it was an interesting thing when he was dealing with the anthology of American music, that he wouldn't specify what race people were. And apparently people thought, was it Mississippi John Hurt was white or something at one point? A lot of people thought he was because of hearing the voice. And I thought it was interesting he didn't specify.
Well, I guess people were struggling to escape these very narrow signifiers, and you know, and I could certainly see, based on what you said, it would be great that somehow the transformation of this music into some sort of notation. Why should it necessarily sound like its progenitor? I mean, that was one of the things I think was interesting in this opera, because I make no attempt to represent typical ACM music, you know, and I remember people telling me, well, how are you going to write an opera about the ACM, you know, and all these kinds of sounds, how can you put all those sounds into the opera? And I said, why should I do that? And, you know, like you guys always say, we're all individuals, this is individualism, I'm representing myself. So it's going to sound like me and what I want. And, you know, and the idea of me trying to, like, say, write an Anthony Branson knockoff, you know, it's absurd. So, or somehow try to represent what happened in the 50s with the jam sessions. Yeah, who needs it, you know? I mean, that, you know, that would, you know, it's sort of old-fashioned nonsense. But anyway, maybe some people expected it, but they didn't get it.
Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in the idea of ethnography and the graphy of it being the written part. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about the potential of multimedia artworks like you've been showing us you've been making. The potential of that to actually get away from the single authorial voice. And I was particularly interested in what you said about Toni Morrison's writing and getting the new community voices to speak. But on the other hand, if you do multimedia artwork, there's still a kind of an orchestration. So I was wondering if you could maybe just speak about, you know, how important is this idea of an authorial voice and acknowledging that versus letting the more believness voice of the community sound. You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question for me. First of all, you can land at various points in the process, you know. I mean, me composing this piece, but at the same time, like you said, I mean, like I said earlier, basically orchestrating all these things toward the depiction of an authorial, of a multiply authored voice, a community voice, and really, in a sense, just one voice. In other words, a lot of these so-called debates about original music were the same debates that people were having inside their own heads, you know. What's going to happen to me if I do this original music? I mean, isn't it better to, you know, like say, well, Duke Ellington, there's two kinds of music, good and bad. I mean, why should I do more than that? These are fears and aspirations and concerns that individuals have within themselves. So in a way, in the whole opera, there's only one voice. Now, the thing is that there are obviously other ways to think about multiply authored text, and it has certainly a very long history. I mean, you know, the first example that comes to mind is like mail art, you know, which is, I think, very great. And now they have internet art of various kinds. And a lot of these artworks, I think what distinguishes them is that there's an improvisative component to them. And that's the moment when you have to really, you know, when you're writing music, I love it. It's a great medium. You know, I get to do a lot of things. It's a playground for me. I think about form. I think about ideas. I try, you know. But at the same time, it's just me sitting at the computer at my desk or whatever doing something. Now, it's not so much that I want to get away from that, as that I find that to be one medium among many. Not something you know, it's privileged at certain times, but then at other times we want to have something else. Like, for example, and I want to fold ethnography into this. Or we could fold historical process into this. For example, with another depiction of Stan Douglas, the work Orchard. Does anyone know that piece? Stan Douglas, the Canadian video artist and film artist, and he did a later one called Luanda Kinshasa. It's basically, they're both historical pieces, but they're partly based on testimony about what it was like. And Orchard was about the Paris of the 1960s, the musicians who came to, you know, all those working class musicians. It wasn't like the old generation of African Americans who sort of came from more or less middle class backgrounds. I mean, these were some down and dirty people like, you know, Frank Wright. I mean, these guys, you know, weren't born with a silver spoon in their mouths or anything. So when they transformed their environment, and I think Stan, when he was making the piece, were asking the people in the film about that era. And then the production of the film, you start to see the process of collective creation in the film, even though it's by him. Now, one example that I've been working on in terms of my work with large orchestras, improvisers. There's going to be one at Huddersfield by this group called the Splitter Orchestra of Berlin. It's part of that whole Echtzeit music thing, you know, that they have there. And it's a very strongly typed group, and I had to write a piece for them. So I'm writing a piece, and it was wonderful because they came, I met them in Stuttgart, and they said, and here's the ethnographic part, they said, we have some questions for you. And they handed me a written questionnaire. And the questionnaire said, well, it was very obvious. Said, first of all, do we really need composers? And what do we get from this? Will doing this process help us to play better? We have some pretty strongly typed ideas about this, but we're looking to break out of some of these identity circles that we've been in. How can we achieve that through a process like this? So I answered all the questions. I answered them in written form, and that really helped me as I make the piece. And the piece turned out to be, it's not really a piece. It's called Creative Construction Set, and it's the term comes from the Creative Construction Company with Mulholland Abrams, Leroy Jenkins, Anthony Braxton, Neil Smith, and so on, and Richard Davis, and Steve McCall, I think it was. And the idea behind the piece, it was very emotional at first, because the music just wasn't happening. It has these cards. You have to hold these cards, and the cards are very basic, like asking people to do different things or take different behaviors, very simple behaviors, and so on. But it wasn't working, and so we figured out that we weren't playing a piece. We were using the cards to construct a piece, and we could construct whatever we wanted. We could construct ourselves. We could refract ourselves through the piece. And at that point, it started to get better. I'll give you one more example. This comes from Seoul, probably, 19-something, a while back. We performed with Ahn Suk-sun, who's a Korean national treasure, pansori singer. Richard Teitelbaum organized a performance of his Gollum opera. And I think in a way, he had two Gollums. He had a film Gollum, which was like taken from his 1920s film, Dear Golem. And then he had Ahn Suk-sun as a Gollum too, although he didn't want to say that. But in any event, we were doing our improvised music thing. Everybody's up there, nobody's looking at anybody, we're all getting into stuff through sound. And, the results were kind of, she looked very unhappy. And so, she looked very unhappy. And she couldn't speak English, we couldn't speak Korean, obviously. So, anyway, she had a gig at the National Theater, so we went. I was so excited. I'm going to hear pansori singer live, one of the greatest singers in the history of the forum. I'm going to sit right in the front. Big mistake. Do not do. It looked at me and said, I looked around, I felt, you feel a draft, right? Oh, goodness. So I got out of my seat and sort of moved discreetly to the back row. And my place was immediately taken by somebody. Immediately. And then the piece started. And what they do is, if you know this form a little bit about it, it's basically, in its essence, kind of a duo form. There's a female singer, and there is a drummer. And the drummer is shouting encouragement to the singer as she sings. And so as they play, there's all this encouragement being shouted. And not only them, but the front row is also shouting encouragement. It's like a Pentecostal meeting, a prayer meeting. What do they do? It means go for it, or, but it's also like those jazz jam sessions where people go, what do they do, I said, this is what we're not doing. This is what we're not doing. We should be looking at each other. We should be shouting encouragement. We should be, when she does some cool thing, we should acknowledge that. And the first time we did it, she smiled. She hadn't smiled all week. And this is the same thing that happened in the Splitter group in Berlin a couple weeks ago, which was that the piece requires you to look at people and show them the card. You can't go off like this, not for a second, And people are used to it. They're used to sitting there just doing their thing. They're getting it all through sounds. It's coming out. It's very repetitious. It's very wonderful. But it wasn't as interactive. And this is where we get to the multimedia part. We talk about different perspectives: the vocal part, the instrumental part, also the visual part. The sort of gestural part becomes very important. So maybe that's a partial response. I don't know if it's completely what you're looking for, but it's all I can provide them. Any other? You complain, any other questions? Yeah, please.
Just a curiosity to know if this questionnaire will be published at some point, or it was just between you and the Splitter Orchestra.
What's the questionnaire?
Yeah.
Oh, I did put a part of it in the program. So you can read it. If you get the program, you can read what they said, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, with their permission, we did it. Yeah. It was wonderful.
I think that should be our last question, Joe. Thank you very
Really,
much.
are we really done here already? I love answering questions, but I'm happy. Nobody has me like,
We can have one last question.
yeah, nobody, you guys really, nobody, I mean, you seem to like this last bit. I was pretty happy. I was feeling pretty down at that awful review. I thought, gee, this is terrible. And I thought, well, people like these things, and so if you don't, what can you do? Anyway,
Can I ask in that case, can I ask
sure, go
question,
ahead.
which is about the opera?
Mhm.
And I was interested about what was your development process of the opera, because
Ooh, that's complicated.
because I realised it was complicated for myself.
Which part of the opera? You mean the libretto I talked about a little bit?
You said about actually about the rehearsals of it and the development of staging and how it grew.
Well, it's had several iterations. First of all, it depends on how much money you have. Like, for example, with this piece here, we had an extra day in the theater. We were able, and we were in a theater in the Czech Republic, in Ostrava, as part of the Austria Days Festival. There were like contemporary, it's like 3 weeks, or basically, how many weeks? No, 2 weeks of contemporary music performances. And so we had enough time in the theater to build sets, to think about lighting, to do video, to do all kinds of stuff. We weren't able to really do all this last thing. And in Chicago, with the premiere, we were able to allow the blocking that they did, allow the strange movements were jointly produced by Catherine Sullivan and Sean Griffin. But in Chicago, we also had 3 actor movers who were providing commentary on what the music was and what the singers were doing. Now, the issue there with all that is that I think some people like the idea that somehow the music should either depict the opera or depict the movement, or somehow the sounds of the, put it another way, I tried to have somewhat noisy and unstable orchestration, but the singers don't really do that. If they're not doing like Jacques Blanc or something, because that's probably not really what they do. So the thing is, it's an interesting juxtaposition, which I think could be jarring to some people to think about that. But in terms of the writing of the words and the writing of the vocal music, my basic idea was very prosodic, to stick with. I wasn't trying to do things outside. It should be something that should sound like a sung version of what we would say to each other every day. I was very sensitive to like these sort of speech rhythms as they were sung by these African American singers, But again, it's not the same as the Harry Smith thing, because when you get it is in a way, because you get finished with what Harry Smith comes up with. He's taken from Thelonious Monk, but it doesn't sound like Thelonious Monk. In the same way I'm taking from Eugene Easton, but it doesn't sound like that. So that's a part of the process of doing it. But in another way, it was very much like a Merce Cunningham event. We all brought our blocking to the space. Catherine brought her ideas, Sean brought his ideas, I brought mine, and we just sort of put them together. So that in a way, there's a collagist effect to it. And we tried to harmonize them, but in the end, we were interested in clashes too. And you can't be too micromanaging about it. You have to let things kind of run. And so that's maybe how this operates.
And you were writing for these specific singers?
Yes, well, you sort of have to do that. But not that I knew everything about what they had done, but we had an audition. And there's another thing about this that you have to think about. I mean, you don't see too many operas other than Porgy and Bess where all the singers are African Americans. That's very unusual. But it had to happen based on what the music was talking about. And without trying to be depictive. But it's not like in 20 years it's going to be like an Othello version or something. It's not going to be like that. But I thought on some level we are making statements outside the frame of the opera, but without having to make a big deal out of it. You just see that, and you see it, and you have your own reaction to it. But we found it was very important for this standpoint that the characters be people of color, which is unusual in the opera world, and but it was also fit into what we're trying to do with the text itself. And the thing is also about, just to say this again a little bit, to go a little further into this, African American opera singers in the States have to be very versatile. And these people can do musicals, they can do hip hop shows, they can sing in Valtrauta, in Wagner, they can do all these things, right? They're very diverse because you have to do all those things to kind of survive. You know, they're not specialists. They're specialists in opera, but they're also people who have a really wide range of vocal talents and possibilities. And I didn't really use all those talents, you know. I wanted to sort of be sort of obsessive about this sort of singing, you know. But it would have been easy to sort of move into a different way had I really wanted to do that.
So I'm just going to say one thing which really struck me about it was which voice ranges you'd chosen. Because to have that contralto range down to a low E flat, and the tenor range, which was quite often above the contralto,
That's right.
a very, very interesting type of different balance of chord. And you would keep playing with that musical idea. That was what really struck me about choosing those particular people with those voices.
Well, you know, a lot of that was the luck of the audition. Like, I would have loved to have had one of those great, you know, Wagnerian type baritones, but we didn't find anybody. So I mean, like, in the end, Gwendolyn Brown is the Wagnerian figure, because she's the one who also has actually sung Wagner, but also she's the one who has that sense of the deepness combined with the depth of the voice, combined with these really high things she can do it. And once I found that out, I guess you could say I did kind of write for her. I mean, it's an unusual vocal trio, you know. It's not the regular thing, you know. Anyway, well, I suppose you all had enough for now. So, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.